Good evening. On behalf of, Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Initiative for Information Arts and Culture Development in Nigeria, IACD, I welcome you all to Day 5 of the 2020 Nobel Dialogue Series. Today, we will be discussing the groundbreaking accomplishments of Louise Gluck, this year's Nobel laureate for literature, and the unique relevance of her work to mankind. To commence the session, I would like to invite our chairperson, Mrs. Idem Osai, to please give the opening remarks. Idem Osai is the founder and executive director, mentoring assistant for Youth and Entrepreneurial Initiative, Mayan. Idem is a 2016 Mandela Washington Fellow, a 2018 Obama Foundation Scholar, a 2020 Edina Global Scholar at Brookings, DC. Most importantly, Idem is a personal friend and a very distinguished member of IACD, Nigeria. Please welcome Mrs. Idem Osai. Idem, you have the floor.
Thank you, Adefemi. His Excellency, the Swedish Ambassador to Nigeria, our most distinguished and most noble Nobel laureate, Professor Wole Soyinka, today's panelist, Professor Sally Ball, the moderator for today's event, Professor Remy Raji, distinguished participants and guests, it is with absolute delight that I welcome you to tonight's session. Tonight marks the 5th day in what has been a week-long series of discussions on humanity's most recent achievements. We have had riveting and thought-provocative discussions across fields of medicine, chemistry, physics, economics. And tonight is the much anticipated discussion in the field of literature. It will come as no surprise as to why tonight is quite celebratory for us as Nigerians. It is a field where we too have asserted and demonstrated global excellence and dominance. We are also especially glad to be graced with the presence of Professor Wole Soyinka tonight, who will also give us certain remarks as the night proceeds. We're very excited to be able to welcome Professor Sally Ball from Arizona State University to discuss the groundbreaking writing of this year's Nobel laureate in the field of literature, Louise Gluck. Professor Sally Ball has, in the course of her academic career, been directly supervised by Louise Gluck, and so brings to this conversation deep insight into the thinking of this compelling and brilliant mind in the study of humanities. Throughout the week, we have gone into a deep foray on topics of genome editing, auction theory, hepatitis, the black hole phenomenon. And it has been quite simplified for the average listener and indeed the common man. This festival of knowledge has been made possible by sponsors like Zartec Limited, Dawn Commission, and the booksellers. We are so grateful that they have committed to this exercise and activity in deepening knowledge. As we look forward to tonight's conversation, we ask you to remain completely attentive. It promises to be absolutely riveting and stimulating. And on this note, I would like to hand over to the next moderator to lead us in the night's proceedings. I welcome you all and bid you a good evening.
Thank you very much, Idem Osai, for giving us the opening remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, we will please like to play a very short clip of Professor Wole Soyinka receiving the Nobel Award for Literature in 1986. I must say, kindly forgive us that the picture is a bit blurred, but I'm sure that we can all enjoy the video. Thank you very much.
congratulations of the Swedish Academy and ask you to receive this year's Nobel Prize in Literature from the hand of His Majesty the King.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'll please like to invite Professor Wale Soyinka to give his remarks. Professor Soyinka, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much. You know, I was mystified. I looked very unhappy and almost as I wish I was anywhere but there. I didn't know it was that bad. It wasn't too bad an experience. So what was I so miserable about that? I think I was just wondering about the Nigerian contingent who'd taken over the entire theater. And I wondered what they might be up to, what tricks they were up to. Maybe the Bata dancers would erupt somewhere or that. I just didn't know quite what was happening. And then also, I must confess, I think I was just overwhelmed by the very surprising rendition of Fela Shoande's music, composition, which had been dug up by the Swedish Academy. Those people, they work very, very hard. And they dug it up somewhere, you know, and when it suddenly erupted, I was sort of overcome, and so I put a very brave I have a feeling that you okay, yeah, coming back. All right, so the remarks about that clip, you know, the very, very creative and emotional. My remarks, very simply today, to say I wish to really congratulate, I beg your pardon, and commend the initiators of this particular program. I think it's a marvelous entry into the interaction of the various approaches to the intellectual and creative disciplines of humanity. This for me is what really the Swedish Academy and the Nobel event represent. And that's been adopted and it's being used within Nigeria to this purpose. Really, I think it's most commendable. How on earth most people got to know about the workings of this Zoom thing, this mysterious thing? I have no idea, but anyway, booksellers, you never know what they're up to. So. Now, in addition, however, this particular edition, I found it very fortuitous and a kind of deliverer of some kind of solace for what we've been undergoing, not just in this country, but universally. COVID, for instance, disrupted World Poetry Day, as you all might remember. In fact, I was flying in specifically for it, and very luckily, I landed before everything shut down, including engagements within Nigeria, just outside in Ghana. And the most painful part for me was the cancellation of World Poetry Day. And I consider this event a kind of compensation, you know, to wax poetically to some of those who would have been present at that event before Nigeria shut down, like everybody else. And World Poetry Day, and that it was really woven around the theme of what I might call the light fantastic in poetry. Many people take poetry too solemnly. Yes, of course, poetry is solemn. In fact, most literature, let's face it, since it derives from reality, especially the kind we have here, tends to be very solemn, gloomy, ponderous, and so on. And I was going to use World Poetry Day as an appeal to would-be poets, consumers of poetry, to remember that there is another side of poetry. And that is one which is light and which is traditional, by the way, both not just satire, but what I call the mock heroic, various genres, which just move away slightly from that ponderous aspect of poetry. So that's what we missed this year, but hopefully we'll still bring it back. In that connection, just to let you know that I'm not just making this up, there was a special publication which was supposed to come out that day. I have it here. I hope you can see it. In case it's reversed over there, let me read what it says. This is a long poem called, and this comes, by the way, after my former long poem on the Chibok girls. That's no laughing matter at all. And I thought, as a contrast, and to relieve us of that despair, that despondency, that will go towards what I call the light fantastic, in this case, the mock heroic. And it's called 2009, A Space Odyssey. And one of the pages says, for children under the age of 90 plus. It's a very long poem for children under the age of 90 plus. Just to show, Yoshina is grinning, because he also indulges very much in what I call the light fantasy, but serious thematic issues in society, but has that light touch which illustrates what I'm talking about, the other side of poetry. But I'm not going to read from my poem tonight. I just wanted to show this to let everybody know what you missed on account of COVID. Instead, I will just terminate my remarks with somebody else's poem from the 18th century in that vein, to let our poets, would-be writers know that we're not going to talk about big grammar now, because otherwise people will start accusing me of that. No. We're just talking about poetry as also a representation, an expression of that aspect which makes it bearable from time to time. People sometimes ask, what do you read? What do you read to relax? Or they begin with, what do you do to relax? I don't go that way because some of them are unmentionable. But it's easier to answer the question, what do you read to relax? And usually it's some kind of poetry. And it's not always the very serious, solemn poetry. Just things which just create a sense of balance, a kind of equilibrium in one. And it's an old one. And it's a long tradition. It goes all the way back to the very beginnings of poetry, that light touch to poetry. This one is actually from the 17th century. An old poet, I marvel. It's a mischievous, very rascally poem, but at the same time very serious, contains some fundamental truths, which is a mission of poetry in whatever form, whatever. It's called To His Coy Mistress, Andrew Marvell. It's one of my all-time favorites. And so I use this opportunity also to answer that question, which I'm constantly being asked. So don't ever ask me again, which is what I read poems that you like to read. I've even memorized it, but as I get older, memory sometimes fails. So I'm going to read it from here so I don't ruin this poor man's poem. It's To His Coy Mistress. Very mischievous, really, and very sexy. And sometimes people forget that poetry and literature are supposed to be also sexy, So here we go. To His Coy Mistress, Andrew Marvell. Had we but world enough and time, this coyness, lady, were no crime, we would sit down and think which way to walk and pass our long love's day. Thou by the Indian Ganges side shouldst rubies find, I by the tide of Humber would complain. I would love you 10 years before the flood, and you should, if you please, refuse till the conversion of the Jews. My vegetable love should grow vaster than empires and more slow. 100 years should go to praise thine eyes, and on thy forehead gaze. 200 to adore each breast, but 30,000 to the rest. an age at least to every part, and the last age should show your heart. For lady, you deserve this state, nor would I love at lower rate. But at my back I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near, and yonder all before us lie deserts of vast eternity. Thy beauty shall no more be found, nor in thy marble vault shall sound echoing song. Then worms shall try that long-preserved virginity, and your quaint honor turn to dust, and into ashes all my lust. The grave's a fine and private place, but none, I think, do there embrace. Now, therefore, while the youthful hue sits on thy skin like morning dew, and while thy willing soul transpires at every pore with instant fires, now let us sport us while we may, and now, like armorers, birds of prey, rather at once our time devour than languish in his slow-chapped power. Let us roll all our strength and all our sweetness up into one bowl, and tear our pleasures with rough strife thorough the iron gates of life. Thus, though we cannot make our sun stand still, yet we will make it run. Today it will be considered a politically incorrect word, but below political correctness when it comes to poetry. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Soyinka. Yes. Next, I'll please like to invite, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to invite Professor, His Excellency, Ambassador Michael Grön, the Swedish ambassador to Nigeria, to give his remarks. You have the floor, sir. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Excellencies, doctors, professors, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for inviting me to this to speak at this year's Nobel Week Dialogue in Nigeria. And it is indeed an honor for me to be able to speak right after the remarks. A little bit nervous as well, to be honest, after the special guests and the Honorable Professor Soyinka himself. First, I would like to commend the host organization, the Initiative for Information, Arts and Culture Development in Nigeria, under the leadership of Dr. Kolade Mosoro and Professor Ayo Banjo, for organizing this entire week. This is Nobel Week in Nigeria, and next Thursday, on the Nobel Day, on the 10th of December, the Nobel Laureates 2020 will be awarded. Why the 10th? Because of the anniversary of the death, actually, of the founder of the prize, the Swedish inventor, industrialist, and philanthropist, Mr. Alfred Nobel. And the Nobel Prize is, after all, considered to be the most prestigious award in the world. Since 1901, prizes in physics, chemistry, medicine, literature, and peace have been awarded. Since 1968, there is also a prize in economics given by the Swedish Central Bank, Riksbanken, in the honor of Alfred Nobel. It is highly commendable to discuss and appreciate these global groundbreaking achievements in very different areas in the context of Nigeria. As the ambassador of Sweden to Nigeria, and given the Swedish roots of the Nobel Prize, it's really a pleasure for me to be part of this conversation here Friday evening. This is a unique year in the history of the world, and several of you mentioned it already, and of course also in the history of the Nobel Prize. Unlike other years where the Nobel Prize award ceremony is held in Stockholm Concert Hall, with His Majesty the King of Sweden presenting each laureate with a Nobel Prize medal and Nobel Prize diploma. We just witnessed Professor Jinka himself in 1986. Quite impressive. But due to the ongoing pandemic still ravaging in Sweden, unfortunately, and also in many other countries, the laureates this year will receive their medals and diplomas in their home countries, as Sweden, together with Norway for the Peace Prize, will host the official virtual ceremonial presentations next Thursday. That will be something completely new in this extraordinary year 2020. I'm aware that this Nobel Week dialogue here in Nigeria officially started on Monday, the 30th, and unfortunately I was not able to be part of that conversation due to other commitments, but I find the topic highly relevant. In line with this year's Nobel Prize in Medicine being awarded to Harvey G. Alter, Michael Houghton and Charles M. Rice for the discovery of hepatitis C virus. I understand that Professor Otegbayo spoke about the discovery of this hepatitis C and how new treatments have improved millions of lives, not least in Africa. But this evening, it's all about literature and poetry. That is the topic close to my heart. And annually, one of the 6 prizes go to, and I quote, the person who shall have produced in the field of literature the most outstanding work in an ideal direction. And you can clearly see the philanthropy of Mr. Nobel, I think, in this very sentence, talking about an ideal direction of the world. Personally, I have great esteem of intelligent literary works and find it thrilling that this particular field has such a strong Sweden-Nigeria connection. As mentioned, the Nobel Prize in Literature is one of the 5 prizes founded by Alfred Nobel, and Swedish writers have won this award 8 times, actually. And as you all know and we witnessed, in 1986, Professor Wole Soyinka became Africa's first Nobel laureate in literature. Indeed, a groundbreaking achievement. And I just finished reading his novel, The Man Died, a couple of weeks ago, actually, and being, by literature, brought back to the horrors of imprisonment during the Civil War. Since then, Nigeria has produced a number of highly talented and reputed writers in prose, in theatre, but also in poetry, such as Chinua Achebe and Ben Okri, but also a young generation coming, Chigozie Obioma, Teju Kole, and not least Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. She is perhaps the most widely read Nigerian author in Sweden at the moment. Sorry about that, Professor Shinka, but I think that is the case. This year, the prize in literature goes to the American poet and essayist, Professor Louise Gluck, for her unmistakable poetic voice. I have to confess that I haven't had yet the opportunity to read the works of Professor Gluck, but I promise I will. I always try to read at least one piece of work by the Nobel laureate every year. It is almost a question of honor to me, and perhaps, should I say, also duty, being a Swedish ambassador. It's therefore very exciting to have Professor Sally Ball joining us tonight, and I'm really looking forward to listening to her presentation about some selected works of Professor Louise Gluck. So what could be more suitable as an introduction for me, personally, into a new literary acquaintance. Looking forward to it. Thank you very much again for inviting me.
And a warm welcome to the Swedish Academy. The Academy has convened and can now announce its decision on the Nobel Prize in Literature. The Nobel Prize in Literature for 2020 is awarded to the American poet Louise Glück for her unmistakable poetic voice that with austere beauty makes individual existence universal.
The Nobel Prize laureate, Louise Glück, made her debut in 1968 with Firstborn and won early acclaim as one of the most prominent poets in American contemporary literature. She has published 12 collections of poetry and a couple of volumes with essays on lyrical writing. All are characterized by striving for clarity. Childhood and family life, the close relations to parents and siblings is a thematic that has remained central with her. Even if the autobiographical background is significant, Glück is not to be regarded as a confessional poet. She seeks the universal, and in this she takes inspiration from myths and classical motifs. The voices of Dido, Persephone, or Eurydice are masks for a self in transformation, as personal as they are universally valuable. With collections like The Triumph of Achilles, 1985, and Ararat, 1990, Glück found a growing audience in the United States and abroad. In Ararat, three characteristics unite to subsequently recur in Glück's writings: the topic of family life, the austere but also playful intelligence, and a refined sense of composition. Glück has also pointed out that in these poems she realized how to employ ordinary diction in her poetry. We encounter almost brutally straightforward images of painful family relations without a trace of poetic ornament. Louise Glück's voice is unmistakable. It is candid and uncompromising, and it signals that this poet wants to be understood. But it is also a voice full of humor and biting wit. This is a great resource when Glück treats one of her great topics, radical change, where the leap forward is made from a deep sense of loss. The motif of renewal comes forth not least in one of her most lauded collections, A Garden of Many Voices, Wild Iris, from 92. Masterly is a collection of Arno from 2006, making a staggering interpretation of the myth of Persephone's descent into hell in the captivity of Hades, the god of death. The title comes from the crater lake west of Naples that was regarded by the ancient Romans as the entrance to the underworld. Another spectacular achievement is her latest collection from 2014, Faithful and Virtuous Night. The reader is again struck by the presence of voice, and Glück approaches the motif of death with remarkable grace and lightness. She writes oniric, narrative poetry, recalling memories and travels, only to hesitate and make a halt for new insights. The world is disenthralled, only to become magically present once again.
Ladies and gentlemen, to discuss the works of Louise Glück, the 2020 Nobel Laureate for Literature, I'd like to please invite our panelist, Professor Sally Ball. Professor Ball is a professor of English from from the University of Arizona, United States of America. And to moderate the session is Professor Remy Raji, a professor of the English University of Ibadan. I'd like to please state that while Professor Salibor makes her presentation, you can please type in your questions in the chat box for Professor Remy Raji to collate after Professor Salibor's presentation. Professor Ball, you have the floor, ma'am.
Hello, everyone. And let me say first that I'm really grateful to be here. It seems a strange good fortune in a year in which most things have felt very small and very close to home. So I'm just grateful to be among you all today. And I'm excited to be able to think about Louise Glick's work and talk about what seem to me the crucial and central tenets of her poetics and her writing life. There are three aspects of Louise's presence and example as a writer that I want to identify and describe to start us off. First, this phenomenon that the Nobel Committee praises, the individual experience made universal. This is a tricky language in some ways. So much of what canonically passed for universal was, well, it was universal for white guys. And I think that really since the 1980s, maybe even earlier, there's been academic resistance to the idea of universality as a goal, because of course it's almost always not true. Still, strict resistance costs us something crucial, the belief that indeed we share enough experience that we can connect to and each other. It may seem to some that including a woman in the ranks to achieve universality was a large step, and it may be that Louise herself helped define the relationship between the personal and the universal into the kind of specificity that moves this categorical issue into more interesting territory. For example, in her essay Against Sincerity, in which she's addressing in the early 1990s a talismanic overdependence on earnest revelation making in poetry, American poetry, I guess, in particular, she summarizes the relationship of the personal to the universal this way. She says, the source of art is experience, the end product, truth. I'll note that she defines truth very clearly as the vision, illumination, or enduring discovery is the ideal of art. The source of art is experience, the end product is truth, and the artist, surveying the actual, constantly intervenes and manages, lies and deletes, all in the service of truth. Much of this essay Against Sincerity is devoted to English romantic poet John Keats, who, she says, drew on his own because it afforded greatest access to the materials of greatest interest. That it was his hardly concerned him. It was a life, and therefore likely in its large shapes and major struggles to stand as paradigm. The self, in other words, was a lightning rod. It attracts experience. The poet's treatment of experience can only arrive at embodied vision or enduring discovery if the poet avoids what Louise excellently calls the decanting of personality, like you pour your little personality into the little glass and pass it around the room. She says that the poet must instead attend to experience with what amounts to a scientific curiosity, open, without foregone conclusions, as detached or objective and as observational as possible. In another essay 25 years later, which is called American Narcissism, from her book American Originality, the narcissism essay comes right at the beginning, second in the collection, and she has to acknowledge this phenomenon early. In this essay, she reads these themes. Here, she hits narcissism with this and further delineates two ways poets present the self. Again, there is the exemplary self, a specimen, that language of science, or alternately, the insular superior self, which does not change or seek change. Like Narcissus, staring at his own image and admiring what he sees, rather than giving it a skeptical little ripple. The narcissistic insular self-poet is like the bullies our parents tried to comfort us about when we were kids. Remember being told, it's because he's insecure that he did that. A big noise, a grand gesture, a claim of self-importance. Glick writes, ours, poetry in which narcissism achieves its most terrifying definition, It is not an extension of the self, but a substitute for a self, as though the lifeless mirror had somehow survived the famished boy. Nothing but that very fragile reflection. She says strategies to discourage entrapment in narcissism, modesty, detachment, and humor. And you'll hear them all in the poems of hers that we'll look at together soon. So that's the first thing, this very fundamental understanding of the role of the poet as an examiner of experience, for whom the personal is a subject of inquiry existing in an examinable context. The critic Craig writes, truth-telling has its root in a passive tone, the ability to observe the mind and the world on each other, changing each other. While there are generalizations to make about any poet across a career, in Louise's case, it's that she's frank, that she's both wry and oracular. She uses classical precedents to anchor contemporary reckonings. It's thrillingly true that Louise has always had a decisive, and I think instinctual, resistance to repeating herself and her strategies. She seeks surprise. She pursues new means of engagement. And as she says in Education of the Poet, each book I've written has culminated in a conscious diagnostic act, a swearing off. This means that she forbids herself recourse to gestures that have become habitual or too easy somehow, and she decides to learn new things. And this has been her whole career. In a Lannan Foundation interview from 2016, 73, and had just published Faithful and Virtuous Night, or recently, she says, what I was learning to do in the later stages, or most recent late stages of my writing life, was to learn narrative, because I'd always written in oppositions. You can find this interview on the internet at the Lannan Foundation website, and there follows that comment a really wonderful discussion about that distinction between writing a narrative and writing in oppositions. But it all takes place after the audience has absorbed this news, this constant reinvention and constant pressure in the poet toward the new. In her poem, Mother and Child, which is in the 7 Ages, a book from 2001, Glick argues that restless seeking is a kind of human inheritance. We're all dreamers. We don't know who we are, she says. She arrives at a kind of handoff, one that is tonally complex, a little defensive, also more than a little empathic with the agitated grown child of the sort of mother speaker of this poem. She says to him, I improvised. I never remembered. Now it's your turn to be driven. You're the one who demands to know. Why do I suffer? Why am I ignorant? Cells in a great darkness. Some machine made us. It's your turn to address it. Asking, why for? This relentless question probably underlies what as her mental approach. She says, I think the only conscious aim is the wanting to be surprised. This is why I said it was an instinct as well as a decision. It's a need to grow, to renew, to not be static. Third thing, finally, is that Louise deploys abstraction like no other poet. It's the cliche of teaching creative writing that one must avoid action, show, don't tell. But we all know as readers that this advice offers only a kind of shortcut. Uninteresting abstraction is somehow worse, both blander and more arrogant than uninteresting detail. Whereas in exhilarating work, very often we remember the telling and we love it very much. We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life rounded with a sleep. Or beauty is truth, truth beauty. Or these lines from Professor Soyinka, slaves do not possess their kind, nor do the tree, with its explosive inverse resonance. I think understanding or meaning comes to us two ways in poems, embodied in an image or gesture, a gesture of evasion, say, or substitution, or through articulate perception. But most attempts at articulate perception fall pretty flat. What Louise is surpassingly, disarmingly good at is making the abstract precise. This sometimes by knitting it to the, as when in The Wild Iris, where flowers regularly speak. Glick writes in the voice a blue flower called Scylla, and I'm going to just put up a little bit of a thing we can look at together. All right. So this is Scylla, this flower. And in the wild iris, there are three kinds of poems. There are poems where the flowers speak, and they speak mostly to the human, who is a writer, a gardener, an artist, and then sometimes the human speaks, and sometimes the sort of supernatural force, a voice of God appears. So this is the Scylla, the flower, speaking to the human. And it says, not I, you idiot, self, but we, waves of sky blue, like a critique of heaven. Why do you treasure your voice when to be one thing is to be next to nothing? Look at how the flower speaker sets up our question of the individual's disdain for the I versus we, then shows us the bed of flowers, but for an abstraction as a modifier to describe it. Waves of sky blue like a critique of heaven. The physical thing, the plant, does abstract work. It's the same color as the sky, but it's better than heaven. And it's right here in front of our eyes. Heaven, what's so great about all that vast blue nothingness up there? Why, the flower says in a critique now of the gardener, why do you treasure your voice, meaning your individuality, your special, unique, expressive self, when to be one thing is to be next to nothing? The next two is idiomatic. It means equivalent to. It has kind of a mean overtone. You're a zero, but it's also literal. You individualistic human, are alone. No one stands next to you. You have isolated yourself. Unlike us, we're all here next to each other, a chorus of beautiful blue togetherness in waves. So that's one of the ways that she deploys abstraction. And that's the one that's probably easier, tied in tight with visible, tangible things. She's also able to put large abstractions into surprising relationship with each other so that they become unexpectedly precise. Here's a stanza from The Empty Glass, which appears in the Seven Ages also. The speaker is talking about difficulty in marriage. And it occurs to me that what is crucial is to believe in effort, to believe some good will come of simply trying, a good completely untainted by the corrupt initiating impulse to persuade or seduce. Everything here is abstract, but the abstract notion of effort is defined down to a particular nub. Despite our doubts, she implies, an effort to improve the relationship can be sort of higher and better than the baser instinct that prompted that effort in the first place. So even if effort arose from something ugly or manipulative, the desire to persuade the beloved that we are right about some issue, or to seduce them, make them desire us when they do not want to. Reconcile standoff in faith, which is unnamed, and effort, which is named, and corruption, which is named, and also unnamed union. It's a chessboard of players, all of them ripe to dissipate as cliches. But instead, the friction of their proximity sparks the opposite way, a depth of meaning and insight. Finally, too, in a way that adds another layer to the question of making the person. Here, the speaker's self-implication, she knows her own effort to heal things up is often driven by these corrupt initiating impulses. It's another of her strengths, the precise dissection of motive, or of the temptation into comfortable delusions. She always applies that dissection as rigorously as self, the other. Okay, so now I would like to look at a couple of whole poems. And the first one is called Witchgrass, and it comes from The Wild Iris also. And so in that book, the flowers who speak many times are garden flowers who've been cultivated by sort of artist, gardener, human speaker. But the witchgrass, of course, is something different. witchgrass. Something, we call this crabgrass a lot of times here too. In addition to witchgrass, it's a weedy, rough, rubbery grass, witchgrass. Something comes into the world unwelcome, calling disorder, disorder. If you hate me so much, don't bother to give me a name. Do you need one more slur in your language? Another way to blame one tribe for everything? As we both know, if you worship one God, you only need one enemy. It was not meant to last forever in the real world. But why admit that when you can go on doing what you always do, mourning and laying blame, always the two together? I need your praise to survive. I was here first, before you were here, before you ever planted a garden. And I'll be here when only the sun and moon are left, and the sea, and the wide field. I will constitute the field. Here's a poem that is working in that way that I began with. It takes a literal experience, weeds in a garden, and it casts it as a paradigm for disorder, disrupting the speaker's maybe English-inspired garden. It's a poem that knows it's on land that once belonged to other people. Also, the ventriloquism is interesting. For Glick to write as Native American would surely be complicated, appropriative, difficult. But here, the figure of the witchgrass permits the habitation of a point of view that objects to the self. That is the central sort of focus of the book in certain ways. And that ventriloquism, that stepping outside is one of the things Louise does especially well. The next poems we're going to look at I chose because I wanted to make sure that you got a chance to see how funny Louise can be. And I think because she has a reputation for austerity and sort of oracular speech, sometimes when people read the poems on the page, they miss the humor or they don't get the tone. And so I just want to make sure that you get a sense of her this way, because she can be really funny. So this book, Meadowlands, is a book in which she continues to learn and develop this strategy that she had in The Wild Iris. Right there were the three voices: the flowers, the gardener, and the supernatural God figure. In Meadowlands, there are a set of poems that are about a contemporary couple whose marriage is in trouble, and then there are a set of poems that are about Penelope and Odysseus and Telemachus, and they sort of take place with Penelope waiting for Odysseus to come back, and Odysseus hanging around with Circe and not being a good, faithful husband. So this first poem is a poem that is spoken by the contemporary wife, who is at home. Midnight. Speak to me, aching heart. What ridiculous errand are you inventing for yourself, weeping in the dark garage with your sack of garbage? It is not your job to take out the garbage. It is your job to empty the dishwasher. You are showing off again, exactly as you did in childhood. Where is your sporting side, your famous ironic detachment? A little moonlight hits the broken window, a little summer moonlight tender, murmurs from the earth with its ready sweetnesses. Is this the way you communicate with your husband, not answering when he calls? Or is this the way the heart behaves when it grieves? It wants to be alone with the garbage. If I were you, I'd think ahead. After 15 years, his voice could be getting tired. Some night, if you don't answer, someone else will answer. We have the scale that Glick strives for: aching heart, weeping, marital discord, moonlight that wants concordance and peace, which are its more usual symbolic territories, and grief. Also, we have the self-indictment, her ridiculous errand, the accusation of showing off, which she points out is a sort of a lifelong problem. And we have the sense of humor, the garbage, the dishwasher, even her self-berating gets a little funny. And this is something that, she performs very well in the way that Hollywood uses it on us in the movies, right? It gets us laughing so that in the end, we are more bereft. and more moved. Now, in the book, the very next poem that comes is called Siren, and it's spoken by the other woman. Siren. I became a criminal when I fell in love. Before that, I was a waitress. I didn't want to go to Chicago with you. I wanted to marry you. I wanted your wife to suffer. I wanted her life to be like a play in which all the parts are sad parts. Does a good person think this way? I deserve credit for my courage. I sat in the dark on your front porch. Everything was clear to me. If your wife wouldn't let you go, that proved she didn't love you. If she loved you, wouldn't she want you to be happy? I think now, if I felt less, I would be a better person. I was a good waitress. I could carry 8 drinks. I used to tell you my dreams. Last night, I saw a woman sitting in a dark bus. In the dream, she's weeping. The bus she's on is moving away. With one hand, she's waving. The other strokes an egg carton full of babies. The dream doesn't rescue the maiden. So again, we have things that are regular characteristics of Louise's work: the classical bias, the surprise, orientation, or turn. The I was a criminal when I fell in love. The sense of humor, the stunning image, that egg carton full of babies, and the oracular last line. Also, it has another thing, a kind of tongue-in-cheekness, because it's the poet, the wife, the Penelope figure sewing her tapestries, these poems, who imagines this voice. It's brutal. Her husband is leaving her for someone who is proud of her waitressing ability. Or that's how she elects to present the intruder to her audience. The layers of tonal complexity are many, and they are dexterously navigated. Okay, we're going to look at just 2 more poems, and then we'll start to talk more all together. The next poem is called Song. Oh, I have some pictures. I'll come back to that. What's happening? I don't know what one. Let's see. There it is. Oh, no. Well, can you see it? Here we go. I guess I'll get that this way. There we go. This poem is the first poem that appeared, I think, after the Nobel was announced. It was published in the New Yorker on October 19th, 2020, and it's called Song. Leo Cruz makes the most beautiful white bowls. I think I must get some to you, but how is the question in these times? He is teaching me the names of the desert grasses. I have a book, since to see the grasses is impossible. Leo thinks the things man makes are more beautiful than what exists in nature. And I say no. And Leo says, wait and see. We make plans to walk the trails together. When? I ask him. When? Never again. That is what we do not say. He is teaching me to live in imagination. A cold wind blows as I cross the desert. I can see his house in the distance. Smoke is coming from the chimney. That's the kiln, I think. Only Leo makes porcelain in the desert. Ah, he says, you are dreaming again. And I say, then I'm glad I dream. The fire is still alive. So when we read this poem, we ask, who is Leo Cruz? He's clearly a guy who makes pottery and does so from within a belief in beauty that the speaker finds alluring, if potentially mistaken. Though she also seems to know he may be right. I think we understand the allure actually by the way this disagreement about man-made and nature-made is recorded. It's kind of like a flirtation that's about the world and also about how well one knows the other person. And that's another person with whom the speaker seems to have an emerging friendship or more, but at a distance we probably recognize as being enforced by our time, this time of quarantine. Our time requires this relationship to exist only in the imagination. She looks at pictures of grasses because she can't travel to see them or Leo. She imagines, we realize, the walk to his house and his kiln, and he reminds her that she's dreaming, she's imagining. There's a kind of double tutelage. They talk on the phone, and he tells her about places she's never been, and this is a new kind of imaginative life for her. And also, she dreams of him, to whom she cannot go. And this is another way of living in the imagination that is new, a lesson she is also learning. I mean, some of what she learns is taught by Leo, pottery facts and grass facts. It's known to him and it's educatively delivered. And some is the lesson she must learn because she has no other option. And she is grateful that in her dream, the fire is still alive. This suggests that having to live only in the imagination end. Okay, I'm going to share something else because I really want you to hear Louise's own voice. And so the last poem we're going to look at this way is, it's called A Work of Fiction, and it comes from Faithful and Virtuous Night. And it's important to say that that book's title is spelled with an N, Faithful and Virtuous Night, the darkness around us in the evening, but it conjures the faithful and virtuous knight with a K, who is a presence in King Arthur's court. And so in this book, Louise has two kinds of poems, again in that same vein of making distinctions or of building these sort of territories of point of view. This time, there are poems that are spoken by somebody a lot like Louise Glick, an artist late in life, considering what it's meant to be an artist for many years. And then also poems from another point of view, a man, a painter, who's reflecting on his own life. And the title comes from a mistake he makes in childhood. He's an orphan and he shares a room with his brother, and his brother is reading the tales of King Arthur, and he reads aloud about the faithful and virtuous knight. But the artist, as a young boy, misunderstands, does not picture a sword and a steed, but instead imagines around them this large, mysterious knight. And so when Louise describes working on this book, she talks about these long sequences of poems in those two voices. And this is the book that she said she learned narrative to be able to write. And she also describes the fact that she felt it was kind of airless, and she was struggling to resolve how these poems were meant to be presented and how they were supposed to fit together. And she ended up breaking them apart into smaller portions and separating them. And then she has a good friend, the novelist Catherine Davis, they've been each other's sort of first readers for all their writing careers, pretty much. And apparently, as she was struggling with what else to do to bring more air into this book, Catherine suggested that she read the very, very short fictions of Franz Kafka. And so Louise read them and sort of had mixed feelings about it, but she thought, well, I can write something like that. And so having never written prose poetry, she wrote a little prose chunk. And she thought it was terrible. And she was going to dinner with another friend, and she brought it along so that she could show that friend, and the friend could say, yeah, terrible. And she could throw it away and go back to suffering and struggling, trying to figure out what to do. But in fact, the friend said, this is good. And so then she went home and she wrote a bunch of these short prose poems that now punctuate the sort of long, meditative, ruminative narrative poems about the lives of the artists. And so here's Louise reading one of those.
A work of fiction. As I turned over the last page after many nights, a wave of sorrow enveloped me. Had they all gone, these people who had seemed so real? To distract myself, I walked out into the night. Instinctively, I lit a cigarette. In the dark, the cigarette glowed like a fire lit by a survivor. But who would see this light, this small dot among the infinite stars? I stood a while in the dark, the cigarette glowing and growing small, each breath patiently destroying me. How small it was, how brief. brief, brief, but inside me now, which the stars could never be. Thank you.
I love that poem for what it argues about reading, a work of fiction, a novel that the speaker has finished, and she's sort of restless, missing those characters, goes out to have that cigarette. I love the way she argues that reading gets inside of us and becomes a part of our being, unlike those remote, and we might even say abstract, stars, which remain in the sky and very far away. The novel ends and we feel its loss, the companionable reading, the physical object of the book, the humans whose lives we've been immersed in. And then we find outside in the faithful and virtuous night, named after a figure from the earliest of books, that companionship isn't lost. It's not at all lost. It burns on inside of us. So I feel like all of my adult life lines of Louise's have been sort of accumulating there, sort of, and I'm happy to put some more poems up on the screen. There are a few more available I can add, or I can take your questions, but
Femi, you can bring in Professor Raji. Professor Raji, the floor is yours.
Professor Raji.
Am I on?
Yes, sir, you're on, please. Professor Raji, can you hear me, sir?
Oh.
I apologize. I think Professor Raji mentioned that he had an internet disconnection a few minutes ago. I'm sure he's trying to sort that out and get in.
In the meantime, Femi, if there are any questions in the chat box, you can read them to Professor Salibor, please.
Okay, Professor Ball, there's a question from Kathy to everyone, to you. She said, can you please say more about the writing in opposition, especially as contrasted with narrative?
Yeah, yes. There's a line in a poem called The Story of a Day, which is in Faithful and Virtuous Night, where the speaker says, I was torn between a structure of oppositions and a narrative structure. And in that Lannan interview that I was quoting from, Peter Streckfus is the interlocutor, and he asks her to describe that, to say what she means about that line. And she tells two interesting stories. One is that she had written that line in a poem that she didn't especially feel had come together, and so she had saved it, and she was sort of looking for a way to make use of it. And she said half the time what you're doing when you're writing is trying to find a place for these sort of things that you can't cast off. And so let's see, she says that the stuff that I quoted in the talk about how in the late stages of her writing life, she was wanting to learn narrative because she'd always written in oppositions herself. She says, if you look at my early work, the poems are very static. They're these frozen, quite pretty lyric moments. If an arm goes up, it never comes down. I literally did not know how to get an arm to move. I had to teach myself to do that. I wanted something that would, well, I don't know where I have the second page of that, but in my pile of notes. But anyway, she wanted to be able to move things around. And I think the structure of oppositions is the kind of structure that is especially conducive to the paradigmatic writing that I was talking about, where there's an image and it has a kind of implicative resonance, and it may be surprising that is what its resonance is. And so instead of moving in a kind of linear way from one thing that happens to another thing that happens to another thing that happens, she would make this sort of stark contrast and then sort of interpret it. And that's a very different thing from moving through time with any kind of linear forward developmental motion. So I think that that's what they're talking about in those moments.
Okay, Professor Ball, I read a CNN's report on why, it was an article on why Louis Gluck poetry matters now. Can you please speak better to that? Why her poetry is so relevant now?
Well, yes. I mean, I think that part of why it matters so much right now is because of its attention to individual experience and its insistence on the value of applying sort of the keenest powers of perception to all kinds of personal experience. And, you know, we live at a time when it's so easy to inhabit collective identity and valuable and has a sort of political power. But I think that the risk of that power is that it's deployed initially in service of freedom, which is an individual experience. And if we lose our sense of the individual inside of that collective, then we might forget what we are kind of fighting for. There was, in the Black Lives Matter conversation in the United States, the poets Major Jackson and Patrick Rosal had a sort of exchange about the fact that we must not forget that Black inner life is the thing that we are trying to also preserve. Not just, that Black Lives Matter is not just about not murdering people, but it's also about cultivating a culture and a society in which the inner life of every person has value. And I think that, you know, Louise is a poet of the sort of richest inner life, and that inner life includes thinking about the collective, as happens in song, as happens in Wishgrass, as happens in her poem October, which followed the September 11th attacks. But it's always from this point of view of kind of deep individual consciousness and intimacy with experience.
Femi, let's try.
Thank you very much. I guess Professor Raji is back on.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
You can hear me now?
Yes, we can, sir.
Well, I was already sending...
yes, sir, we can hear you, sir.
I'm already sending some comments in lieu of my absence, that I didn't have the opportunity to say a proper greeting to my teacher, Professor Neo Shundari.
Oh.
Thank you, sir, and of course, everyone, greetings. I have found Professor Sally's presentation very exciting, and I refer to it as being very intimate, looking into Louis Gluck's poetry I was fortunate about 18 years ago to have met Gluck in Massachusetts. I do not have any bragging right to have said that I've known her, because if I knew she was going to be the Nobel winner for 2020, I would have asked for a full autograph. But it's good now making the connection. And I said that in case the problem persists, Louis Gluck's poetry, according to Professor Sally Ball, has a great connection, especially the early poems. Has great connection with Wordsworth's idea, the ideal, the preference for the simplicity of language. And there's something Keatsian also about it. Professor Sally Ball says Gluck has a reputation for austerity, and I can agree no less. But beneath this simplicity is a certain denseness, which sometimes is made possible by personal histories, narratives, even classical allusions that became very paradoxical also. That we can say she writes very simply. In fact, in a definition of a poet, she said early she started writing poetry and she became acquainted with the simple, something delirious about the way she chooses the word. But then in choosing the word and presenting something that is personal, she extends it to be very universal. So there's something paradoxical about Louis Gluck's poetry, that it is privatist, it is intimate, and essentially also it becomes very universal. And that is something that I find exciting in her poetry. Of course, there have been comments by Jide Adefokwe, who also observed the same, that there's a lyrical simplicity of this narrative verses. Abigail Wender talked about the poem in Gluck's poetry. And now Jide Adefokwe has asked the question, can you speak a bit about the background of Louis Gluck? For example, our roots, both geographically, our geographic roots, our cultural roots, which probably define the sense of self and our outlook to life.
Yeah, so Louise was born in 1943. Her family lived in a sort of suburb of New York City on Long Island. Actually, her last name is pronounced Glick. The umlaut is Hungarian in origin, and so it's Louise Glick, not Gluck. Although hardly anybody knows, and it happens all the time, the other pronunciation, but it's Glick. And the Glick family, there's a sort of apocryphal story about them, which is partly true, which is that her father helped to invent the X-Acto knife. Do you know this knife that you use for like architectural work or craft making? The sort of looks like a pen and has this razor blade edge. And so people like to say that, of course, this poet of such incredible precision, is the offspring of the X-Acto inventor. In fact, it was like her father's brother-in-law, and he wanted it to be a medical tool, but it couldn't become one. And so anyway, it's a story that's a little too sweet. But she had she was raised in a family where she had a sister. She had a sister who had died before she was born, and this group of 5 populates much of her work. The book Ararat, in particular, writes about that sort of family of origin. When she was growing up, she was a painter and a writer. She doesn't have a conventional college degree. She studied with the poet Stanley Kunitz. She spent some time at Columbia, but she never graduated from college. she eventually she published her first book, which is a book she sort of doesn't really like to talk about. She doesn't renounce it exactly, but she sort of says, don't read that one. She had published that book. She was entering a period of silence, which she also says, you know, she has these long periods where she doesn't write anything and nothing happens. And she had gone to give a reading at Goddard College in northern Vermont. And she says when she got there, she just felt, oh, this is where I'm supposed to be. And she had never thought she wanted to teach. She thought that teaching would sort of dilute her capacity to be a writer. But instead she found that she could use the same kinds of questions on her students as she used on herself, and that this was nourishing to her. In fact, the poet Claudia Rankine, who was her student, says this very beautiful thing about Louise's, it's possible that I don't have it printed out, but about just the incredibly rigorous attention that Louise pays as a teacher, which I can also second. But anyway, she started teaching in Vermont in her late 20s, I think, at Goddard, and ended up moving there and staying there and living in Plainfield outside of Montpelier, planting this garden, which she worked on for years and years and years, which eventually became this sort of source material for the wild iris. Let's see, in the 90s, she and her fiction writer husband, John Dranow, decided to divorce. She ended up moving to Cambridge and still lives in Cambridge. And she now teaches at Yale in the fall and Stanford in the spring. And her son, she has one son, and he lives in San Francisco, and so she gets to sort of be with her son when she's in California in the spring, and then in the fall she's in the Northeast, which is kind of her home territory. I would like to connect to something about the simplicity of language that I think is quite interesting and important. Education of the Poet essay that I wrote, where she talks about the diagnostic act at the end of each book and the sort of shifting away from the things that have become too easy for her. She describes this attraction to simple language. She says, the axiom is that the mark of poetic intelligence or vocation is passion for language, which is thought to mean delirious response to language's smallest communicative unit, to the word. The poet is supposed to be the person who can't get enough of words like carnadine. She's very funny. Not my experience. From the time at 4 or 5 or 6, I first started reading poems, first thought of the poets I read as my companions, my predecessors. From the beginning, I preferred the simplest vocabulary. What fascinated me were the possibilities of context. What I responded to on the page was the way a poem could liberate by means of a word's setting, through subtleties of timing, of pacing, that word's full and surprising range of meaning. It seemed to me that simple language best suited this enterprise. Such language, in being generic, is likely to contain the greatest and most dramatic variety of meaning within individual words. I liked scale, but I liked it invisible. I liked those poems that seemed so small on the page, but swelled in the mind.
Okay, thank you very much. Adam's comment, she loves how the poet legitimizes the granular individual experience in the vast universal space of what Salibor calls collective identity. Again, for me, that is also the element of the paradoxical in Glick's poetry. And then Professor Salibor, you made a statement that I would like you to extend further on. You noted that Glick has an affinity for making the abstract, precise. Do you want to extend on further on that?
Oh, yes. I just think that I mean, this is it must be a constitutional gift for Louise, because it is so often true. This is where cliche lives, in the large, sweeping, abstract statement, and she does manage to anchor abstract things sometimes with this sort of fusion with concrete imagery or detail, and other times by sort of triangulating them with each other in a way that surprises us. I'm just looking for an example that would be easy to pull from one of these poems. Another example. It could be that this will work. Oh shoot, that's the wrong page. Oh, here we go. So there's a poem called Celestial Music from Ararat, where the speaker and a friend have been walking on a sort of mountain road in presumably, and they come across a little that is a caterpillar dying on the side of the road, and there's ants crawling on it, and the speaker, the Glick character, notices this and wants to clean it up and save the life of this thing, and the friend is like, oh come on, like you have to let nature run its course, and has this sort of toughness, and so the end of this poem goes like this. In my dreams, my friend reproaches me. We're walking on that same road, except it's winter now. She's telling me that when you love the world, you hear celestial music. Look up, she says. When I look up, nothing, only clouds, snow, a white business in the trees, like brides leaping to a great height. Then I'm afraid for her. I see her caught in a net deliberately cast over the earth. In reality, we sit by the side of the road watching the sunset. From time to time, the silence pierced by a bird call. It's this moment we're trying to explain the fact that we're at ease with death, with solitude. My friend draws a circle in the dirt. Inside, the caterpillar doesn't move. She's always trying to make something whole, something beautiful, an image capable of life apart from her. We're very quiet. It's peaceful sitting here not speaking. The composition fixed, the road turning dark, the air going cool, here and there the rocks shining and glittering. It's this stillness we both love. The love of form is a love of endings. So in that passage, you have plenty of things that are quite specific happening, so that the idea of death is, right there in front of them. The caterpillar is dying, and the seasons are changing, and there's all these things that make it the large abstract idea of death a tangible presence for them in their conversation with each other. At the time, there are places where the abstractions are put in relationship with each other in ways that surprise us. So I feel like I saw two examples. She's always trying to make something whole, something beautiful, and capable of love apart from her. So here we have this idea that the artist creates something that is whole, beautiful, and it defines wholeness and beauty by independence from the maker, right? And that's the surprise. This is an abstract statement, but these are things that we don't necessarily associate each other readily and by habit. So they surprise and they sort of jolt our minds into the kind of, we have to do a little work to understand it, because it's not what we presume about the abstraction. It's been conceptualized for us in a new way. And so it's startling and sort of enlightening to see those abstract things put together in that particular way. And in the same way, when we get to the very end of the poem and we have this beautiful scene, the darkness falling, the air going cool, the rocks shining and glittering, sitting there together quietly looking out at this sort of beautiful darkening landscape. And she says, the love of form is a love of endings. And again, these are abstract concepts, but they're put together in a way that is surprising. And so I think that's only sort of two things, the idea of ending and the idea of form. But they're sort of, I don't know, they make each other specific to this very moment. And some of it's in relationship to all of the sort of sensual and physical detail that we've seen so far. And some of it is just the sort of startling way that she puts large things close together.
Okay, thank you very much, Rosabelle. Eden Musa has a very interesting question for you. And it's about the nature and as well as the value of the dialogue that you find in Glick's poetry. She noted that she wants you to shed more light on why Louise employs the medium of flowers in her poetry, in particular in Iris, in a very ventriloquial style. The question is there a purity or neutrality or beauty and therefore trust that the dialogue of flowers depict? And if so, is it an attempt to merge all life forms in one boundless conversation so that there is an interaction between nature and man, and also to send a message to man for not listening to nature? And that's why I said it's very interesting, because it's almost like three questions in one. Yeah. I hope you got that.
I mean, I think that this is one of the strategies that Louise Glick uses to cultivate kind of detachment and sort of scientific attention that she believes the poet needs, right? If you're always sort of in your own point of view, she in a poem, I think in the 7 Ages, she talks about always looking from one vantage point, comma, like a sniper. And that's what she doesn't want to be, right? Like, she doesn't want to be the person who's always in the same place, taking aim and you know, shooting easy targets, right? And so I think that there are lots of ways that this ventriloquism works. Sometimes it's, but they all contribute to this sense of context and of being a human among other humans and also among the rest of the world. And I mean, certainly the flower poems, I mean, I think that when the book came out, probably the critical response would have been that, you know, the God voice and the flower voices and the human voice are all very human, and they're all doing a very kind of human assessment of relationships. But now, you know, in the university, we have, at ASU, we have a post-human network, and there's a lot of sort of post-human conversation meant to remind all of us that we are not the only sentient creatures on the planet. And it seems clear that whether or not Glick was thinking about that or not, sort of in an overt, conscious way, those flower poems say different things based on her deep attention to those different flowers and their own characteristics, which she had spent a lifetime observing. And so I think that there is something about the sort of larger context in which any individual moves that is not just other humans, but also the natural. I'm sort of losing track of the parts of it now, and the chat has moved. Yeah, purity, neutrality, and beauty. I mean, I think sometimes those are the qualities, and then other times, you know, the poems are very messy because the flowers are not oversimplified, right? Like anything that's too pure or too neutral or too beautiful is going to lack dimension. And I think, you know, that the complexity of those flower voices is that they have, just as the human voices in Glick's work have, they have petty concerns, they have self-delusions, and they, you know, they're flawed, and speaking from a place of knowing that one is flawed is another of the trademarks of Glick. So, like, probably if you Googled her, the first poem that would come up is, I think it's called The Red Poppy, and it's the poem from the Wild Iris that ends, "I speak because I am shat." And I don't know, that seems to arrive at that need to understand flaw and impurity, imperfection, and things like that. But I think too that in a way the larger thing is something maybe more like the sublime, where you know, you have a sort of shocking experience that changes you, and it might be terrifying, or it might be beautiful, it might be love, or it might be nature, but it's it provokes change. And every speaker has been provoked in some way, I think, especially in the Wild Iris.
Okay, thank you. From Mark Halliday, there is a question that relates to translatability, how the poems of Louise will sound in other languages. Having been known to use simple language and of course syntax, Mark Halliday is asking whether in translation, whether there will be special pitfalls or challenges awaiting Louise translators.
I think surely so. I mean, I think that what she says in that passage from Education of the Poet about how it is it turns out to be the simplest word, have the most kind of layers of meaning attached to them, and, you know, sort of send their implications out in different ways, all from this kind of pivot point of a very simple idea. That can be hard to translate because those layers of implication and meaning are not necessarily present in the closest translation in another language. I've not read the translations of Glick into French, which is my other language, so I haven't seen how that works. But I was laughing. I felt that planning this talk, oh, I love Louise. I know Louise really well. I know her work. It's seared in me. It's going to be so easy to write this patient. And then, of course, because of how much I care, it's much harder. Right? It's much harder to make, you know, small and, you know, translatable and clear. And I think that that's what happens to a translator who's looking at a very simple sentence, right? That this is going to be easy. And then you realize that, in fact, what makes something look easy is the thing that makes it difficult. Yeah.
I don't know if there are any other questions, so but I also like to go back to your presentation. In writing, you said that Louise Glick's, for Louise Glick, each book is a diagnostic act. I don't know whether I got you right when you said that. Mm-hmm. You said each book is a diagnostic.
It's followed by a diagnostic act. So when she finishes a book, then she looks at it and she says, these are the habits that I am leaning on too much. This is something I know how to do. I can't do it anymore. It's a way of forcing herself into a kind of invention of a new poetic practice. So that's what that's about.
Okay, Femi, do you have any question or?
No, sir. No question, sir.
Okay. Professor Shudari, sir?
Oh, well, enjoyed listening. I just was wondering, Is there any limit to simplicity? And I have read somebody who called Louis Glick the poet of the falling world somehow. Well, I don't agree totally with that, but I'm just looking at a tendency that we see quite a bit in some American poetry, where what is called the confessional. You know, these are great lines, no doubt. There are times you also look for excitement. Poems and so on are there, but what about the play with words? I think there are one or two things to interrogate about Glick. This is certainly a profound writer, but are we bound to agree totally with her definition and practice of simplicity?
I think absolutely no, we are not, and that neither is she, and that part of this inventiveness in her work shows itself in the poems of A Village Life or A Faithful and Virtuous Night, which are lusher and sort of, there's a lot more words, you know, in those poems, and that simplicity has, you know, she's also departed from it in certain ways. And I think too, that if you look at her, you know, she was the judge for the Yale Series of Younger Poets, which chooses a first book by a young American writer I think writer in English anyway, every year. And during her tenure, her selections were very strange and surprising. And she is not somebody who creates kind of clones of herself as a teacher. And so I think that, you know, the great risk of making any kind of claims like I was doing today is that there's going to be, you know, the exception to the rule. And I think that's what makes, you know, a poet interesting. If the rule always applies, then, you know, it's predictable, right? And we already know the answer. And so anyway, I think, you know, if she were here, she would tell you what I had said wrong, and she would tell you, you know, some more eloquent thing than I am saying now. But I don't think that the definition of a founding principle means that it's the only thing she does, and I definitely don't think she would impose it on anybody else. Even as she's a rigorous reader, and she asks, you know, intense questions about why you've said what you've said.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. Simplicity is one, brevity is another. Well, in my creative writing class, Oshunari can bear me witness. The idea is to start writing poetry and not go beyond 20 lines. And then when you get more mature and then you got more confident, you can go on and end up with an epic. I've looked through most of the works of Louis Glick, and the longest would go to about 40 lines or 50. Is simplicity the same thing as brevity? Does she have the capacity for writing something epical?
Well, I mean, there's two answers to that question. I think one is that, you know, all of the books since Ararat have are sort of one meditation or one subject or one story that's being told in smaller poems, right? So, you know, when you read Ararat, you are introduced to the characters in this family, and the collection is a unified thing, and it has its own movement. And so A Village Life, A Faithful and Virtuous Night, The Wild Iris, Meadowlands, all of these books have been called, you know, contemporary epics or sort of large narratives or large meditations. And in the later two books, there are longer and longer poems, I think longer than 40 and 50 lines. so I think, I mean, again, she, the things that heavily characterize the earlier work are things that she's grown further and further away from over time. Brevity and simplicity are not the same, although they may share a kind of aversion to excess and waste. And Louise is a person who has that aversion. And so she is not leaving much lying around that she thinks is not making a very sort of serious contribution, even when the contribution is like those brides.
Quickly after this answer and close it, otherwise the Zoom will stop.
Hello?
Anyway, she's just very sort of rigorous about getting rid of things that don't feel like they're really contributing. And I quoted that strange simile from Celestial Music about looking at the snow up in the trees like brides leaping to a great height, because there's no brides in that poem, and they're sort of irrelevant, and yet they're so striking. And so when I say that she gets rid of extraneous things, it isn't that she gets rid of the sort of the whimsical or the surprising. There's a kind of surreality in the prose poems in Faithful and Virtuous Night. I mean, there's definitely sort of strange happenings. It's not that everything is kind of honed down to the nub of relevance, but that she's just also not a poet of excess or maximal sort of spew.
Okay, thank you. We have a question here by Jide.
Thank you very much, Professor Block.
Yeah.
Professor Raji, I'm sorry I have to interject, sir. Our time is fast spent. We need to round up the program about now, sir.
Well, thank
Professor Ball, thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. It's been great listening to you sharing deep insights on Louise Gluck's work. And on behalf of IACD Nigeria, I'd like to thank you all for your participation tonight. And I'm sure that as much as I did, you found this session meaningfully enlightening. I'd like to thank our chairperson, Ida Mosai, for chairing this session. Special thanks to a special guest, Professor Wale Soyinka. Taking excerpts from your remarks earlier tonight, sir, you said literature should be sexy. It was indeed sexy listening to you tonight. Thank you very much for your participation. We hope our annual Nobel series will inspire emerging writers to follow in your steps to aim high for a Nobel. His Excellency Ambassador Michael Hallgren, the Swedish ambassador to Nigeria, we thank you for joining us. Professor Salibol, we thank you again for sharing deep insights into the groundbreaking writings of Louise Gluck. Professor Remi Raji, thank you for steering the conversation of our discussions tonight. Special thanks to Professor Niyi Oshundare and Emerita Professor Cynthia Hogg. We couldn't have done this without the enduring support of our sponsors, the Dunn Commission, Zatec Limited, and the booksellers. We appreciate your support. Tomorrow, we will close the program with peace. We will be discussing the groundbreaking efforts of the World Food Program that earned them this year's Nobel Award for Peace. We enjoin you to please join us tomorrow for a most fascinating discussion on peace. We also enjoin you to share this program with your family, friends, at home, at work, and in your communities. Till then, peace to you all. Have a good night rest. See you tomorrow. Thank you.